Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another episode of the Classroom Series, a series where I teach you everything you need to know about sewing. And today we're going to be talking about seam finishes. In today's video, we are going to be talking about seam finishes, specifically a seam finish called the turned and stitch. While there are many different kinds of seam finishes and I'm going to be doing a video over every single kind, today we are going to start off with the turned and stitch because all it requires is a sewing machine that can sew a straight stitch and an iron, which if you are sewing, you probably already have both of those. So let's dive in to learn about the turned and stitched seam finish. Out of the many different kinds of seam finishes, the turn and stitch is very simple and easy, though it might be a little bit more time consuming compared to other seam finishes. A turned and stitch seam finish is essentially where you're going to be taking the raw edges of our seam, turning them under, pressing them, and stitching them down with a straight, regular stitch. As you can see, it gives the seam a nice, finished, and clean look, something that looks great on the inside of garments and will definitely keep your raw edges from fraying. For this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create and sew a turned and stitch seam finish. Since this is a sample, I'm going to be using a square that is 6 by 6. To create a turned and stitch seam finish, since it is a way that we finish our seams, we first have to create a plain stitch and seam with the 6-inch square. Now, creating a seam is simply how we sew all pieces of fabric together. We're going to take two pieces of fabric and sew them together. So we're going to take this 6-inch square and we're going to cut it in half down the middle. Now that we have two pieces of fabric, we are going to place them on top of each other, right sides together, and pin our layers together. Now, since these pieces are solid colors, there's not really a right or a wrong side. If you are using a print fabric, you are going to want to pay attention to the right side of the fabric. The right side of the fabric is going to be on the inside so that it is right sides touching or print to print. We're going to lay our fabric on top of itself, put two pins to hold our layers together, and then we are going to go sew a plain seam. Now, a plain seam is just a straight stitch on your normal stitch width and length, and typically sewn on a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now, depending on what pattern you are using and what the directions say, the seam allowance might be different, but standard seam allowance is going to be 5/8. Since we are wanting to sew on a regular straight stitch, we are going to make sure that our sewing machine stitch function is going to be on the straight stitch. The numbers on your sewing machine might be different, but for my sewing machine, a straight centered stitch is going to be 0, 0. On my display screen, I see that it is on a 0, 0, which is my straight stitch. And my stitch length and width are already preset by my sewing machine, so I'm not going to mess with them.
For sewing our plain seam, we are going to want to pay attention to the lines that are etched on our needle plate, which is right underneath our presser foot. You're going to notice that there are different measurements. We are specifically going to pay attention to the 5/8 inch seam allowance line when we are sewing a plain stitch. Remember that a plain stitch or seam is simply any stitch that we use to attach two pieces of fabric together. In order to apply seam finishes, we first have to have a seam attaching two pieces of fabric together, and that's what you see here.
And that gives us our plain seam. This is your typical seam that you're going to be using for any sewing project. Now we're going to take it to our iron and we are going to press our seam open.
We have connected the two pieces of fabric using a plain seam. We are going to press our fabric and seam open. Anytime you sew a plain seam, you are going to want to take it over to your iron, press your seam open, and this is the first step in applying our turned and stitch seam finish. Now that we have pressed our seam open, we are going to move one edge of our fabric over to meet the other so that we have a raw edge of our seam exposed. This is where we are going to turn it under, press it, and apply our stitch. Using an iron and a tape measure or a seam gauge, you are going to fold the raw edge of your seam allowance in 1/4 of an inch. This edge is going to be folded towards the wrong side of your fabric. Making sure that it's 1/4 of an inch all the way across, you are going to press it. You want that raw edge to be close to your seam but not touching it. Going in with your seam gauge or tape measure, you can double check that it's pressed 1/4 of an inch inwards. You're now going to flip your fabric over so that you can put pins into the edge that you just pressed down. This will help your fabric not shift and also hold that pressed edge in place so that you can stitch it. We are now going to repeat all of those steps on the other side of our seam allowance, folding in the raw edge 1/4 of an inch using a seam gauge or a tape measure. Then we are going to press it down with our iron to hold it in place and crease our fabric, making sure that that raw edge is close to the seam but not touching it. Once our edge is pressed in, we are going to flip our fabric over and put pins to make sure that the edge we pressed stays in place while we take it to our machine to sew. You have now completed the turned portion of the turned and stitch seam finish. The next step is to stitch right where our pins are to hold the edge that we pressed in place with our stitch. This is why it's called a turned and stitch. Before you start sewing, you are going to want to make sure that all sides of your fabric are moved out of the way so that we are just sewing on the edge. So that right side of your fabric, you are going to want to move over and shift it to the left so it's underneath. Then we are going to place our fabric underneath our presser foot, put our presser foot down, our needle down, and we are simply going to be sewing on the edge right where our pins are. For sewing the stitch portion of this seam finish, we are going to back stitch at the beginning of our seam, and then we are going to continue straight to the end of the edge that is pressed, taking our pins out as we go. We want our seam to be in from our pressed edge, not completely on the edge. When you get to the end of your seam, don't forget to backstitch. We are then going to repeat those same stitching steps on the other edge of our seam allowance. Again, we want to make sure that we backstitch at the beginning of this seam and continue sewing straight down the edge. Remember that we don't want our seam to be right on the folded edge, but just a little bit inside. We're going to continue sewing to the end of our fabric or our seam, and then we are going to backstitch when we get to the edge to make sure that our seam is locked into place.
And this is our turned and stitched seam finish, and it's called the turned and stitched because we turned that raw edge under, we pressed it, and we stitched it. What you do not want is to see any seams on the right side of your fabric. All you want is a nice crisp seam that is pressed open, and you only want to see the seams on the edges of your seam allowance. And that is it. That is the turned and stitched seam finish, one of the many seam finishes that you can use to finish the raw edges of your seams when sewing.